All right, everyone. Thank you and welcome. I'm excited to be here. I want to thank the head table for inviting me. I want to thank Stephen Holliday for those opening remarks. And again, as he alluded to, I want to thank the institution of Rotary. That's pivotal moment wherever I was at. These tables listening to the topic about transportation really shifted how I thought. I was looking into the inky blackness of outer space and heard about fixing Sherwood Forest and just that practicality of transportation and making lives better on a daily basis for people really grabbed me. And so that is gonna kind of like set the stage for this presentation of thinking about just because something is really big and really cool and new doesn't make it useful. And so with that, we're gonna get into the structure of the presentation. No. So it's actually going to be the left is a bit more academic, and what I'm trying to do here have it be a bit more informal, a bit more personable. I'm trying to have be a bit more of a story about how my thoughts have changed over time. And so with that, I'm going to give some background upon some of my work that I've done. And so this is a presentation that is about work that I gave, and so it was 2 years worth of work. It was 8 different researchers. It was the team that I led, multiple publications, academic presentations as well. And so what did this work do? We looked at freight in New York City, and we tried to understand where did every freight truck go, how many stops did they deliver at, how much freight was they carrying, what kind of freight was it, how much CO2 did they emit, how much fuel did they consume. So we really tried to understand in depth about freight in New York City just as it is right now. And as we were wrapping up with that, the question became, where do we go next? And so one idea that I came across, which I was really excited about at first, is this idea of the mothership and flying sidekick. I thought it sounded super cool, and the basic premise is that you have your Amazon delivery van, and you have the drones flying around, and that you have your van make a loop, and all the drones are coming out, and it feels very futuristic, very sci-fi. But as I began to think about its actual implementation in New York City, the questions I started asking myself are, does this make freight delivery faster? And maybe a little bit. Does it make it cheaper? I don't know that it made it enough to matter. Then you start to ask the questions of, what problems does this actually create? What about the safety of the package being carried by the drone? What about the safety of the drone itself? What about nearby pedestrians and buildings as the drone's flying around the very busy New York City? Then you get into other issues of the weather. It snows, it rains, it's windy. Then you get into legal guidelines of this drone is going to be capturing footage, it's going to be recording things. And you start to get into all kinds of very messy frameworks that aren't even the transportation problems itself. And at that point in time, it began to feel like a technology that was in search of a solution in search of a problem. And now, whenever we are looking at disruptive technologies, we must be very clear that we are identifying what the problem is and that we understand this problem. We must understand what is our solution improving. We must understand what are the trade-offs, what is left unsolved, and what new problems are being created. Transportation is a very specific type of problem. Our risk profile in transportation is very large. Our problems are ubiquitous, they are expensive, they involve a lot of public trust. Our risk tolerance also changes very much. Because we have this large amount of public trust, we must be very careful about what we do. And also in transportation, we are measured much more by our failures than by our successes. To put a point on this, in transportation, we measure the number of fatalities every year. And that number has been roughly the same since the 60s. It's between 35,000 and 45,000 deaths every year on the American roadways. However, the number that they're not telling you is that the deaths per mile has actually dramatically dropped. It's only 30% of what it used to be. But again, the point is not how many lives that we are saving, it is how many more that we have left to save. And that very high barrier is what we must place on ourselves to make sure that the technology we are implementing in the world is effective. Because if we are not considering these issues, we can be considered asleep at the wheel. Thank you, thank you. So what comes next then? The real world. So this image is one that's not specific to transportation. It is called the Gartner hype cycle. And so this is the idea that as disruptive technologies come in, you have this initial technology trigger, and you have the hype cycle. You have this large inflated expectations, and you have the trough of disillusionment, and eventually you reach a point in time wherever this technology finds its niche, it finds a solution, it becomes well developed, and it is practical to implement. And almost every technology will follow this cycle. We can think about EVs. The EVs from 15 years ago were not really ready yet in the way that EVs are today. 3D printing, speech recognition, these are all technologies that, as we use them today, are very effective and very useful, but early on were stumbling blocks. Some technologies never recover. I'm personally skeptical of NFTs and blockchains that they may not actually reach that plateau of productivity. But some move faster. Generative AI, as we're seeing now, is already coming into the workforce, and this is a much newer technology. So everything will be somewhere along the cycle. So then we have to think about what does it look like to implement these technologies. And one of the problems with delivery technologies is that you have so many edge cases that they are hard, and your edge cases are almost like whack-a-mole, in that when you solve one, another one pops up. And so this actually begins to show the value of human labor. And so for those of you who are thinking, drone technology in Baton Rouge would be much easier than drone technology in New York City. That makes sense on its surface, but consider this. How many people have front yards or backyards? I would assume most of you. But then how many people have front yards or backyards with no power lines nearby? No large trees nearby? It must be fenced in, because if you are dropping a package off on your front yard, we already have problems with porch piracy. If you're moving that package further out towards the street, you're going to see further issues. Then, okay, your yard is fenced. Do you have a dog? And if your dog is going to see your package come in, so you start to see all these different problems that come in, and then it's not even getting to questions of, as you have a drone flying over, Amazon is going to be recording everything. How many of you are comfortable trading your data to Amazon to have that delivery? How many of you are comfortable with your neighbor trading your data to Amazon for their deliveries? These are the questions that you really start to have to ask about these implementations. And it's why we should think about simplifying with these new technologies and going after middle mile innovations. They are much less flashy, but they are much more practical. That the goal should be to serve currently unmeetable demand, and that they should augment our current systems. And so one use case of drones actually is delivering medicine in rural African communities. The problems that they are solving here is that they're delivering goods that are time sensitive, such as blood or vaccines, and that they're solving infrastructure limitations. That in these communities where they don't have well-funded direct roads, by having this drone, you're able to bypass those limitations entirely. And so the process is that the good is parachuted from the drone towards a large ground target. And by doing this, the drone never has to slow down. It never has to go near the ground. You simplify the flight path, you simplify all these different aspects of it, and this is where you have a disruptive technology actually meeting a use case. In New York City, we're also considering these same types of issues, wherever we have a limited transportation supply in New York City. So in transportation, we think about supply and demand very much from an economic standpoint. Demand would be people want their goods. Supply is how do we have the capacity to get it to them. In the past, whenever we had infrastructure supply issues, we would build more infrastructure. Well, in America in general, but especially in New York City, we don't have the ability to build much more infrastructure. And so we have to look at where do we have limitations. Our limitations in time, that obviously during your peak hours, you're going to have a lot more competition for that road. So if you could have autonomous trucks delivering off hours at nighttime, then all of a sudden, no one's competing with you for that road at 10 p.m. at night. And so by having it be an autonomous vehicle, you no longer have to have that driver who's working their normal hours. And if you're delivering to a warehouse, that entire process can be autonomous. You solve that last mile process by not even engaging in it. You are simplifying that very edge case. And again, we look at our spatial constraints, that we are not building new roads in New York City, but we have ports in New York City. We have all the rivers. And so by being able to move freight onto the East River and the Hudson and deliver at the number of ports across the city, you can actually move a lot of that freight off of those roadways onto the waterways, which is how we used to deliver freight. And so even a lot of these technologies which are disruptive actually have very classic solutions. In much the same way as using bicycles to deliver freight. So this down here is a device called an e-quad. And so this is an e-cargo bike. It looks much more like a golf cart, but it does technically have pedals on it in order to classify as a bicycle. But again, in high density areas, if you can move freight off of trucks and onto other vehicles, we're finding that it's cheaper, we're finding that it's faster, we're finding that it's cleaner, that it's quieter, and that these are the type of solutions that are able to really make a difference in New York City. So then the question is, okay, why do people make mistakes? Why do people not always get this right? And the question that it is very hard. To do these things well requires a lot of multidisciplinary knowledge. You have to understand the hardware, you have to understand the software, you have to understand the politics, you have to understand the economics, you have to understand the transportation aspects of it. And that all of this also has to have bottom-up feedback. That image that I showed of the driver, that we need their feedback. If we're going to build a vehicle and they tell us this doesn't actually work to get that freight from the van to the door, then we didn't do our job right. And so being able to have to talk to the people on the ground who are implementing the transportation solutions, again, makes this more complicated. And because you're going to have to iterate, all of this is expensive and it is time consuming. And the answers to this question, again, are what will the future look like? The problem is the future is unexpected. And the future is also happening now. That it might not be flashy, it might not be showy. That I know the title of this presentation was autonomous vehicles, and I actually have not addressed autonomous vehicles, and that is because I'm skeptical of them in a lot of different ways. All the technologies I've presented today are ready now. They're technologies that are useful today, and that they might not grab headlines in the same way, but they are meeting challenges. This is what the future actually looks like, and that transportation, again, has our specific implementation use cases. And so one of the last things I want to leave you with is that even in the future, nothing works. And so we should be skeptical of technology. We should be skeptical of these new solutions, and we should hold them to a high standard, and that just because something has all the bells and whistles on it does not make it good. Thank you.
We have questions right here. You can use the mic. I'll be in the back. Well, I'm coming to you first.
What is the law? What are the laws governing using drones? Like, if you're going to point B and you go over people's yards, so that's point A, you know, is that, what are the laws? I know that is getting controversial with privacy and all that.
Excellent question. So our question is about drone law. And the answer is it's very complicated and it changes location to location. There are whole fields of drone law that are evolving and they're very new. And it's going to change a lot. I'm not an expert on the legal aspects of it specifically, but I know that it's very much something that we should consider. That's another one of the problems of autonomous vehicles in general is that you have to have a lot of different types of sensors in order for them to work. You need to have camera, you need to have LiDAR, you need to have radar, you need to have mapping technologies, and all of those require a tremendous amount of data, and all that data will capture us at some point in time. And so how much data are we willing to give up? What is that privacy balance? You know, theoretically these things are promising new solutions. What is it worth to us? What type of legislation do we need to have to protect ourselves? And do we trust the companies who are implementing this to do it fairly?
Can you tell us more about your report that you shared at the beginning? You had a team of, what, 8 people?
Yes.
Their roles, how you collected the data, how you built that report?
Yes, thank you. So that presentation, we started with open data entirely. So one of the problems that transportation faces is that it is very data intensive and data is expensive. And so we, being an academic agency, did not have the same monetary resources. So what we did is we began with tax data. From tax data, you're able to look at business sizes, and from business sizes, you're able to understand business types. Business types tells you about what type of freight they need. And so from there, we were able to aggregate that to a certain level. We were able to distribute that spatially across the city. And from there, we were able to develop intense mathematical models, which would be able to map that freight demand onto tour routes. From there, we take the mathematical model, we turn that into a computational model. And from there, we take the computational model and we validate that against real world data. And so that project had a lot of different researchers who helped me with the coding, a lot of different researchers who we built an app for the New York City Department of Transportation to use. We had researchers assist in that data collection, because again, the open data, while it is free, it's also messy and it's also dirty. And so going to tax records and collecting them and cleaning them and turning them into usable records, and that whole process was an entire master's thesis for one of my coworkers. So it was an incredible process. Thank you for that question.
So you mentioned, obviously, New York City's a lot different than Baton Rouge. No. What have you learned in New York City, though, that may be applicable to a business environment like ours?
Yes, so while I think some of the delivery technologies require a certain density threshold, I think other ones will be valuable anywhere. And so I think one of those is electric trucks. I think that electric vehicles are coming. And I think not even for environmental reasons, I think purely for monetary reasons. That one of the things that my research is showing right now is that they are cheaper to operate per mile. And so if we can then make the arguments to businesses that if you want to deliver your goods more cheaply, you will make the transition to an electric truck. And so that is independent of a density threshold, and that is what we're trying to show is also even with conservative estimates, that a lot of issues right now with electric trucks are around range issues, battery issues, and if we can show that even with conservative estimates, this technology will only continue to get better. This technology is still very, very new, and we will see battery improvements continue in a lot of different phases of life, not just in transportation, also in power storage and anywhere where that might be an issue. And so as we advance that technology, I expect it to become very viable everywhere.
I remember years ago in New York City, UPS started not making left turns anymore. And I don't remember the statistics, but it was remarkable how much time they saved. And I think this was at the beginning of the GPS era. So are you kind of combining this new technology with common sense things like not making left turns?
Excellent question. And so that practicality is very much one of the things that I want to make sure is baked into my work, that I'm constantly trying to speak to professionals in the New York City Department of Transportation, in the New York City energy companies, making sure that assumptions that we are making are reasonable ones. Other work that I did was I helped work with a New York City school bus company, and I was able to help them work on their data process, and I was able to bring them research that a peer of mine did, and they went one paragraph in and said, oh, they made this assumption here, none of the rest of this is useful to me. And so that was an incredibly instructive moment to me, that it is very important that what we are doing in academia needs to not stay in academia. And so that's why I try very hard to make sure that this is all going to land in the real world.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Haggai, I appreciate the presentation.
Thank you.
Knowing what you know from your expertise, and speaking concerning the Internet of all things, can you give us a glimpse of the future in about 10 years, what we might be surprised to see?
Over what range of topic, or just any topic, or?
Yeah, just any topic that we might like. Give us a glimpse of the future.
The all-knowing Haggai.
To avoid getting too far out over my skis, I'll stick to transportation. I will say that I think as electric vehicle batteries get better and better and better, I think that we will see more transitions to those type of vehicles. And so then I think we will also see autonomous vehicles come in portions and in phases. It won't be a switch that is flipped to wherever overnight every vehicle becomes autonomous. It will be that they are implemented at certain locations, at certain times, under certain conditions. And so one of the things that I think will come first is that you'll see autonomous trucks on freeways. That drive from San Antonio to Los Angeles is you and the roadrunners, and it's a long straight line, and we can get a car to drive in a long straight line. And so those are the type of places where you'll see autonomous vehicles first, especially as that battery technology gets good enough to wherever you don't need to pull over at all. Because right now that might be a multi-day process where if you have a human driver who's restricted to the number of hours they can drive in a day, and you're restricted by the size of your fuel tank. Well, if your electric battery can now get you that entire distance in a single charge, then you no longer have to stop. And so because the US is so geographically spread out, especially west of the Mississippi, you're going to start to see a lot of that type of trip happen. It will also happen at nighttime when, again, you're not competing with the same number of other vehicles. It'll happen in good weather. And so this will be a slow process that happens over time. And it might be 20 years before you really see Uber be replaced with autonomous vehicles in a city. That it's going to be a slow, messy transition, and that there will be mistakes, there will be bumps. And that's part of why I think trust in this technology is so important. That we need to make sure that whenever we are implementing it, we are really thinking about where this can go wrong and how do we prevent those disastrous cases, because you as the public should be skeptical of these new technologies, and it is incumbent upon us to earn your trust on them. Yeah.
A simpler application for transportation might be in the airline industry, since most of that's controlled anyway. How do you see that?
Excellent question. So I don't know as much about airline transportation research. As I understand it, a decent portion of it is human and machine augmentation. That, again, I think another one of these things is that we have a lot of conceptions about artificial intelligence. It likely won't replace us for a long time. There will be a large period of time wherever humans and machines work together to solve problems. And I think we already see that in a number of use cases in our life. And so I think a lot of airline pilots work with the autopilot. That's where that phrase comes from. But I think that how long before we fully pull a human out of the cockpit, I think that would be a very long time.
What types of freight are you specifically focusing on when you're talking about delivering stuff? Or are you just focusing on it as like a broad topic?
Great question. So her question was about what types of freight are we focusing on? So there's really a couple different types here. You have your standard parcel delivery. So that is something that you get from your Amazons or your FedEx. You also have larger scales of freight. And so those will be delivered by different carriers who in some ways have different logistical processes, but in some ways they are similar. And so with that project that I described at the beginning, we're able to classify all different kinds of freight from, beer, wine, alcohol, and food, all the way up to construction equipment. And so each one of them has a different pattern. Obviously, if you're delivering construction equipment, you're gonna make fewer stops in the day than the beer truck, but each of those will still follow some of the same logic patterns.
Hi, you mentioned autonomous vehicles not necessarily replacing Ubers, but of course, right now there is Waymo, so what type of data are you seeing coming out of that project?
Great question. So the Waymo team is the best one because they have been so selective. They have operated in a suburb in Arizona for about 5 years now, and they've recently made the move into San Francisco, and it's seeing mixed results. GM had their Cruise project, and their Cruise project was simply not run as well. They made other mistakes, and the city of San Francisco is very unhappy with them, and so a lot of that progress is slowing down. Uber, actually, that was their original path to profitability, was that they believed that if they could replace the human driver, that is how they would become profitable as a company. That led them to making a lot of risky behaviors, and that is ultimately why Uber hit the pedestrian in 2018, is that they had turned off their safety systems because they believed they needed to test more. And so these are the types of concerns that we need to be having, that this disruptive technology needs to be safe first and then can grow from there. And so the autonomous vehicles in the cities, they are only in certain parts of the city, they're only on certain roads, they're only at certain times of day, and again, it's only in one city right now. And so it's going to take a lot more work to be able to get that generalizable. And even then, once the technology is ready, again, you have the social aspect, you have the political aspect of it, that a lot of people are just uncomfortable with driving down the road and seeing the car with no person in the driver's seat next to them. And so that is a valid concern. And so it's important that we're able to address the concerns of the individuals.
You were talking about closed communities.
Yeah.
Closed communities
Yes.
being a test bed. And I know at UNCC in Charlotte, they have food deliveries in drones and autonomous little vehicles. And they look like tiny little robots. But initially, they were very cautious with pedestrians, very cautious on campus. And it is a closed campus, so there's no driving. But now, my brother-in-law's a professor there. He's telling me that you have to get out of their way. And so they're on a mission. And so I assume that LSU, Southern, and other universities will be following quickly behind us, because what student doesn't want food delivered?
So this is a great question. You're talking about these delivery devices. And again, I am skeptical of them in some ways because they're limited in their size, so they're limited in their speed, they're limited in how much they can hold. And so you really have to have a dense area in order to justify them. But we would never implement them in New York City because our sidewalk space is already so hotly contested. And so, as you said, that the pedestrians have to get out of their way now, and people don't like giving in to this tiny little device. And so while they might be safe simply because they're going too slow to actually cause any issues, are they actually delivering the food fast enough? Are they delivering the food cheap enough? Is it still just a novelty? Because we've seen Pizza Hut had a pilot in Houston, I believe, where they were delivering pizzas with an autonomous vehicle, and they would put the pizza into the car and the car would drive and the person could come pull it out. And this was a pilot which got a lot of national press, but ultimately the company Pizza Hut decided that this was a nice, fun pilot, but again, it didn't move the needle far enough for them in order to justify it, in order to accept these risks that are coming. And this is a lot of where this autonomous vehicle technology is that it looks good, it has a lot of shiny bells and whistles, but it's just not ready for prime time yet.
Hi, so you mentioned that we talk about implementing in the US, but there are areas where it can be much more effective. And so you talked about the continent of Africa and the lack of infrastructure that is there. Where have you done this presentation that when you have mentioned this portion of it, that people have been receptive to it, or is it falling on deaf ears as it relates to that component of the presentation?
Can you expand your question a little bit more for me?
Yes, so when you say this is why it would make sense to do it to deliver in remote villages, are there companies, individuals, organizations that are saying, you're right? How can we become more involved in making this happen, or do you feel like that portion is falling on deaf ears?
Oh, those are actually companies that exist today.
Okay.
So those are actual, the slides that I showed are, it's not large yet, it's not grabbing a lot of national headlines, but these are companies which are really making inroads and actually making a difference there.
Hey, I wanted to know, as far as the transportation of things, how would it affect sensitive items as far as delivering hazardous material?
Excellent question. And so this again goes with the risk profile that we deliver different types of goods differently. And so in New York City, we actually are looking to deliver hearts for emergency operations via drone. Because New York City has congestion, if you can transverse the length of the Isle of Manhattan in 10 minutes, that can be the difference in saving a life. And so it's really important to understand what exactly is it that we're delivering and what exact problem that we're solving. And so something like hazardous material, does this need to be delivered autonomously? Are we truly saving something in some way, or is that human element still very valuable?
Last question.
All right. You mentioned safety as a key component of this. At what point do you decide how much death or how many accidents are reasonable, because human drivers are killing human drivers every day?
Great question. And the answer is that that's not for me to decide. that is why we have legislators, that's why we have community feedback. There is no one single number that is that much better. And so some people will say, if we save one life, if we are just, one life better, then that is worth it. Some people say that I'm more comfortable with a human making that mistake because it's a human making that mistake. And so that is the trade-off there of, we know what it's like to be that human in that situation, whereas we don't know what it's like to be the computer. And so is it 10%? Is it 50%? Is it 90%? These are questions that we as a society need to be asking, and that there is no one singular line.